Funding for this program was provided in part by the Division of Continuing Education at Brigham Young University.
We welcome you to our study, our continued study of the New Testament. We are studying the second half of the New Testament, and particularly the Acts of the Apostles. With us today are members of the Department of Ancient Scripture in Religious Education at Brigham Young University. Professor Ray Huntington, Professor Emeritus Robert J. Matthews, and Professor Jeffrey Marsh. And I'm Robert Millet. Well, we had gotten about halfway through that first missionary journey. Let's turn to chapter 14 of Acts and notice some things here. Let's have, if we can, Brother Matthews, first read the preface to chapter 14, the introduction.
Persecution attends spread of gospel. Paul heals a cripple. He and Barnabas hailed as gods. Paul stoned, revived, preaches, elders ordained.
Now the first, if you will, Bob, the first two verses.
And it came to pass in Iconium that they went both together into the synagogue of the Jews, and so spake, that a great multitude, both of the Jews and also of the Greeks, believed. But the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and made their minds evil affected against the brethren.
Talk to us a bit about, again, their modus operandi. How do they do their work?
Well, there are several ways of doing missionary work, but it's evident in the New Testament that the brethren would go to the synagogues first. Now that has a lot of has a little risk with it. But Paul was capable, and the Lord chose well when he chose Paul, and he would go there and speak. And it says here, he spoke so well that many Jews and Gentiles believed. Now, here's the system. These people that are sitting in the synagogue have friends and relatives who are maybe not there. And these Gentiles particularly would be so. So that the referral system is put in place. The very system that we use now with referrals is evident in the way Paul conducted his missionary work. As they went and made the rounds, and I think we haven't said it yet, but we need to say it, that on this first mission they visited a city called Antioch. That's not the Antioch we talked about earlier. It's a different Antioch.
Yeah, the first one we read about was Antioch of Syria. This is Antioch of Pisidia.
Yes.
Up in Turkey.
Up in Turkey. And a much smaller Antioch. In fact, today it's called Angora. But on the first part of the mission, they visited each of these cities in order. And they taught, and they baptized, and they confirmed. And then they'd go on to the next city. On the return trip, they organized branches. You might notice in, look at verse 21 of chapter 14. And when they had preached the gospel to that city and had taught many, they returned again to Lystra and to Iconium and Antioch. So this is the second time they've been to those places, confirming the souls of the disciples and exhorting them to continue in the faith, and that we must through much tribulation enter into the kingdom of God. And when they had ordained them elders in every church, and had prayed with fasting, they commended them to the Lord on whom they believed. And then they passed on to the other cities. So we get a little pattern there, that first they went among the people and taught them and converted them and baptized them. On the next visit, they organized them.
Good.
That's good.
Good.
Priesthood organized.
Notice they passed through the cities of Lystra and Derbe. It appears that this is the area in which Timothy and his family had lived. What do we know about Timothy? We know about his mother later. We know about his grandmother, Lois and Eunice. And we know that his father was
A Greek.
a Greek. And so it's during this period of time, presumably, that Timothy is baptized with his family and brought into the church. It was during this time, too, look over in verse 19. Ray, why don't you read for us 19 through 20.
Now there came thither certain Jews from Antioch and Iconium who persuaded the people, and having stoned Paul, drew him out of the city, supposing he had been dead. Howbeit, as the disciples stood round about him, he rose up and came into the city, and the next day he departed with Barnabas to Derbe. And when they had preached the gospel to that city and had taught many, they returned again to Lystra and to Iconium and Antioch.
You know, it was Elder Bruce R. McConkie in his New Testament commentary that suggests what happens here is that Barnabas raises Paul from the dead. They become very popular. Let's just back up slightly. In chapter 14, Paul performs a healing. Look at the nature of the healing as described in verse 8. There sat a certain man at Lystra, impotent in his feet, being a cripple from his mother's womb, who never had walked. The same heard Paul speak, who steadfastly beholding him, and perceiving that he had faith to be healed, said with a loud voice, Stand upright on thy feet, and he leaped and walked. See, that's reminiscent to me of Acts chapter 3. Mm-hmm. I can still remember Elder Jeffrey Holland, before he was Elder Jeffrey Holland, showing us a comparison between the ministry and work, especially the miraculous work of the Apostle Peter, and then showing parallel miracles performed by Paul, as if Luke were trying to say something very important, that although Peter was the president of the church, Paul was not one whit behind Peter in terms of apostolic power and authority and the right to work miracles. This sounds very much like the healing of the man in Acts chapter 3.
Mm-hmm. Well, think about his courage. Ray, you made a comment during a break about Paul's courage. What does Luke tell us about Paul's character?
I think it's an insight that Luke gives us, and in sort of conjunction with what Brother Matthews has just said. You know, their work wasn't done. They needed to go back through these cities once again and organize and prepare these people. But for me, I mean, he'd been nearly killed, or may have been killed, in Iconium. If I were Paul and I wanted to return, I wouldn't go back through those cities. I'd make a wide girth around them, but not
leave
Paul.
a note.
Yeah, or send a letter in this case, but not Paul and Barnabas. They returned to those cities one by one. I think Paul's fearless. Barnabas is fearless. And
So not only do they have the spiritual character that Peter has, they also have a depth of character. They're willing to do the work of the Lord regardless of the consequences.
Let's make one other observation. We compared the healing of this cripple with the man that Peter healed at the Gate Beautiful. In both cases, they never had walked. And you think of them as children, they probably watched other children. You notice how it says it here in verse 8, and he'd been crippled from his mother's womb, who never had walked. And when he healed him, look at verse 10, said with a loud voice, Stand upright on thy feet. And he leaped. He didn't just, but he leaped. And the man that Peter healed, it said he leaped up and down and held them.
And notice the response. This gets interesting. It tells us something about, clearly Barnabas is the senior companion. But we learned something in verses 11 and 12 about who is probably doing most of the talking. And when the people saw what Paul had done, they lifted up their voices, saying in the speech of Lycaonia, "The gods are come down to us in the likeness of men." And they call Barnabas Jupiter, meaning Zeus. And they call Paul Mercurius, meaning Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. Why call him Hermes? Hermes was the herald of the gods. He was the spokesman for the gods. And so it sounds like Paul is doing most of the talking.
I've wondered, too, when you see statues of Hermes, which we saw a lot of them when we were in Turkey, he's always young. Mm-hmm. And Zeus and Jupiter is always old. And I'm wondering if Paul at this time is younger than Barnabas.
Well, I think that probably is the case.
Well.
Barnabas is an older, more experienced, seasoned veteran in the church. Paul is a young missionary.
He's Paul's mentor.
And they do think they're God. They want to offer sacrifices to them with garlands and at the gates, and would have done sacrifice, but they run out and prevent them. Verse 15, "We are men of like passions with you." We're just common men. But I like verse 18, "Even after telling them, don't offer sacrifice, we're just men like you, even with these sayings, scarce restrained they the people that they had not done sacrifice unto them." And yet there's another group in the very next verse who want to kill him, and in fact do.
Yeah. Okay.
Paul is about 40 years old at this time. His first mission is about 45, 46 AD. And Paul was born about 5 AD. So, young man.
Really young man.
Really young.
Pretty young man.
Chapter 15. Perhaps one of the most important chapters in the New Testament in terms of the growth, the spread, and some of the challenges of the church. Verse 1 indicates, "Certain men which came down from Judea taught the brethren and said, Except ye be circumcised after the manner of Moses, ye cannot be saved." Now, as Brother Matthews mentioned in a previous session, when we see the word circumcision, often it just simply is a code word for the law of Moses. What do we call these folks who continue to push, though members of the church, though Christians, continue to push for the perpetuation of the law of Moses? What do we call them?
The Judaizers?
The Judaizers. And so a group of Judaizers have come and began to say, no, you've got to live the law of Moses. And so this is the issue that then begins to come up.
Now, they've come from Jerusalem to Antioch. Now, on a map, it's up. Geographically, it's down. Mm-hmm. So that's why it says they came down. But it's rather interesting.
Everything is down from Jerusalem.
That's correct.
I just find that interesting, too, that Joseph Smith, in translating the Book of Mormon, though he'd never been to Israel, never missed that when he describes up to Jerusalem and down from Jerusalem.
Bob, just a thought here. I've often thought that these sort of self-proclaimed church leaders, these Judaizers, I've often thought that perhaps together they in talking and hearing about the success that Paul and Barnabas have had, the growth in Antioch, maybe they're thinking things are getting out of hand here. We've got a lot of Gentiles coming into the church. They're not living the law of Moses. And
we're losing the old church like we knew it before.
Yeah, and we need to get a grip on it again. And
so what happens? Paul and Barnabas are sent to Jerusalem to try to get a reading on this from the leadership of the church, right? Now, I want to pause in the action here in this account and have us, if we could, flip over to the second chapter of Galatians. We've often said Acts has great history and the epistles have great doctrine, and the only problem with that is that's not accurate. Because Acts has great doctrine and the epistles have pretty good history. And so look in chapter 2. Jeff, if you'd read for us, starting in chapter 2 of Galatians, start with verse 1 and go through verse 4.
"Then 14 years after I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, and took Titus with me also, and I went up by revelation, and communicated unto them that the gospel which I preach among the Gentiles, but privately to them which were of reputation, lest by any means I should run or had run in vain. But neither Titus, who was with me, being a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. and that because of false brethren unawares brought in, who came in privily to spy out our liberty which we have in Christ Jesus, that they might bring us into bondage.
2 more verses, if you will.
To whom we gave place by subjection, no, not for an hour, that the truth of the gospel might continue with you. But of these who seemed to be somewhat whatsoever they were, it maketh no matter to me. God accepteth no man's person, for they who seemed to be somewhat in conference added nothing to me.
Let's go back and look at this. Notice some of the great points that he's making here. If Saul's conversion is in approximately, 35 AD, Bob? Is that about right?
Yes, I think so.
About 35 AD, 14 years after that, that means this conference we're going to hold at Jerusalem, the Jerusalem conference, is taking place in about 49 AD.
49 AD. Mm-hmm.
So 14 years after that, he's describing, I go back. Notice what he says in verse 2 about how he goes back. He knows how to set up all his ducks in a row. I went up by revelation, communicated unto them that gospel which I preach among the Gentiles, but privately to them which were of reputation, lest by any means I should run or had run in vain. What did he just say?
He's saying, I went to see the Quorum of the 12 in the first presidency before the conference was held.
So that we could make sure we were on the same page.
Yeah.
And
he took Exhibit A, who is Titus.
Titus, who was with me, being a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. But neither Titus, who was with me, being a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. Another way of saying that is, but we did not compel Titus to be circumcised.
Now this is good to establish too. He's not going to try and establish doctrine. He wants to get a read on what the doctrine. This is an issue that's been raised up. Let's just get a clarification.
Here's a case, and maybe we're bringing it up prematurely, but here's a case. I remember learning this in Brother Matthew's class years ago. He's bringing Titus as a case study. He's bringing him uncircumcised. Now later, in the 16th chapter, he takes Timothy, and what does he do? One of the first things he does before they leave on their mission? He gets him circumcised. Why, Bob?
It's the problem of, it's one thing to have a revelation and establish a doctrine. It's another thing to get people to accept it, and you've got to get people to listen to you first. Since it was well known that Timothy's father was a Greek and that he had grown up not as a Jew, he would not have been circumcised. And they would know that. And so Paul said, we did this to him not because he needed it for salvation, but it was expedient so we could get him to listen to us.
And so we would say of Titus, we're not going to circumcise him. It is not necessary. We will say of Timothy, although it's not necessary, it is expedient.
Expedient.
We'll keep ourselves from getting into problems. Let's just go ahead and do this.
There are others in the church, though, who'd come in a whole different way than Paul did and with a different point of view. And now you're going to have this moment where in Jerusalem they're going to meet to talk about it. And one of the things I think is amazing is this isn't just a minor change in a program. This is a major sea breeze change. And how do you delicately bring people along who have grown up under one system, introduce a brand new system for others without offending both groups and causing dissension in the church?
That was such a major problem. This can be described this way. This is what happens when new revelation confronts tradition.
Yep, that's an excellent way to say that.
Notice in the chapter 15 of Acts, Peter rises up, reminds them of the experience he has had with Cornelius. Let's get that on the...
This is verse 7,
yeah,
right?
Verse 7. And then he said, notice in verse 10, Brother Matthews, read for us verses 10 and 11.
Now therefore, why tempt ye God to put a yoke upon the neck of the disciples, which neither our fathers nor we were able to bear?
Meaning?
None of us kept the law of Moses to perfection.
Who can keep the 613 commandments perfectly? None of us.
You know, a good point, Bob, on this. Brother Matthews brought up the point that he probably met with the First Presidency and the Quorum of the 12 before this conference ever was convened to agree on certain things. And I think both Peter and Paul agree that the law, in this case in verse 10, was a yoke. In Galatians 2, Paul says, why go back to that bondage? They're both, they see it the same way.
Yes.
They're
It's
both
like
in agreement.
the Nephites in the Book of Mormon who said, we keep the law until Christ comes, but it's a bondage to us, it's a yoke, it holds us back. But we know that we're under oath to keep it until that moment. And now they're trying to reverse that.
Yeah.
Verse 11, Bob?
But we believe that through the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ we shall be saved, even as they.
Okay, there's that concept again. Now let's set this up. We don't have a lot of time to do this. What's the issue here? James, who presumably, this new James, is presumably a member of the first presidency. We have Paul as a factor, Peter, they seem to be together. We have James, who seems to feel some special responsibility for the saints in Jerusalem, many of whom were still a bit tied to the law of Moses. And bless his heart, you have this wonderful Peter trying to hold the church together. And you can almost see Saul, young and impetuous, brilliant, but pushing on this side, and you've got the Jewish Christians over here pushing on this side, and poor Peter trying to hold those two horses.
One thing that we all have to learn is patience. And again, you have the revelation, the doctrine has been announced, but you have to be patient with getting people to come around to it. And so I thought you said it well. Here's Peter trying to keep the church together. Peter is a magnificent administrator. And James has the confidence of the Jewish part of the church in and around Jerusalem. So Peter presides, but he has James conduct the meeting.
Bob, we presume this is James, the brother of the Lord?
Yeah, it has to be. Rather interesting that he probably replaced the other James.
That's correct.
You know, I just thought this is a great lesson for us. We have members of the church who are committed at varying degrees of levels. All of us are. And there may be some in a group when a commandment or a program is being moved forward that struggle a little bit. There may be others who are ready to go. And one of the gifts of leadership is to find that delicate balance, to bring people along and at the same time hold others in a place where they can be of service. Just very quickly, when Brigham Young came to Salt Lake City, there were some saints who wanted to leave the valley. California had gold. California had a better growing season, better weather. It's got Disneyland, you know, and, well, later. And Brigham Young had a dream one night. He went to pick up some sheep in Davis County, and he saw the wildest, oddest flock of sheep coming towards him. And as he walked past them, some were decrepit dwarfs, some had long, shaggy hair, some were perfect. And then he noticed the man in the wagon herding them was Joseph Smith. And he said, I looked at him and I said, Joseph, what are you going to do with all of this most interesting group of sheep? He said the most interesting group he'd ever seen. And Joseph said, they're all good in their place, Brigham. They're all good in their place. And he said he woke up the next day and had learned that every member is good in their place. And not all will be able to make the same commitment and contribution.
Excellent story. So, one of the difficulties is what kind of a decision will we get rendered here? And James takes the podium now. Very interesting. James, a member of the first presidency. Peter yields the floor to James, and James makes a recommendation. What is the nature of that recommendation? Where is it? Starting in verse 18. Ray, why don't you read that for us?
Known unto God are all his works from the beginning of the world. Wherefore my sentence is, that we trouble not them which from among the Gentiles are turned to God, but that we write unto them that they abstain from pollutions of idols, and from fornication, and from things strangled, and from blood.
One more verse.
For Moses of old time hath in every city them that preach him, being read in the synagogues every Sabbath day.
There's the stickler. That's the key to the whole decision.
This is interesting, isn't it?
Yep.
This is clearly Paul, well, I won't say clearly, but it just may be the case that Paul left this conference a little frustrated. Why? They didn't go as far as he wanted them to go. What's the answer? Well, clearly, we will not require the Gentiles to live the law of Moses that come into the church. What's unresolved?
They didn't say what the Jews do.
What about the Jews in the future? Does that Jewish Christian father, does he circumcise his son? Do they observe the law of Moses? And so I remember hearing Brother Matthew years ago say, one of the more important things to come out of this Jerusalem conference is ambiguity. That is, there's progress made, but it's a half step forward.
And a necessary half step. To push it all the way might have caused some real dissension and feelings, but to move it along
That's right.
a step at a time allowed people to grow into it.
As a wonderful general authority said to a dear friend of mine once, he said, always remember, people are more important than truth.
For expanded information on the content of this episode of The Acts to Revelation, visit our website at byubroadcasting.org. Funding for this program was provided in part by the Division of Continuing Education at Brigham Young University.